So good afternoon, everybody. It is so great to have all of you. So what I'm going to do today is I want to have a few introductions from everybody. And then we're going to plunge into the first class. All the classes are going to be recorded. So if for some reason you were unable to attend, there's a YouTube channel that is a Temple Bethel YouTube channel. I can give you the link, but all you have to do is go to YouTube and put in Riverside Temple Bethel. And there you are. And I will do I have a playlist and I will have a list just for Introduction to Judaism. And so you'll be able to go there and, if you've either missed a class or, the class seemed confusing and you want to listen to it again, or it was so great, you want to hear it again, either way. The other thing I just want to mention for people who are maybe not so used to Zoom is that if you go to gallery view, which is on the top right-hand corner of your screen under view, gallery view allows you to see everybody, and speaker view allows you to just see the person who's speaking. So that is a useful function to have. So what I want to do is I want quick introductions, like please don't take 10 minutes because, as I said, then we won't have time to actually have a class. What I'd like you to do is just give me your name and where you're located and a sentence or two about why you're taking the class, because I want you to see that people take the class for a lot of different reasons. Some people just want to know more about Judaism. They might be Jewish, they might be Christian. I have not had any Muslims ever take the class or Buddhists, but I've had Christians and Jews. Some people want to convert, but as I've said to most of you I've met with individually, there is no need to commit one way or the other about converting. Okay, so if you're interested in converting, this is a journey and we'll see how it goes. By the end of it, you might say, this is for me, or you might say, this was fun, I enjoyed it, but it's not something I'm going to do. And so if you are interested in conversion, then I will meet with you about once a month to see how you're doing. Now, I make one recommendation, and that is to keep a journal. So if you could keep a journal with your thoughts as you take the classes, as you come to services, as questions occur to you. I did get a list of wonderful questions from one person. They're way too complicated to go through, I think, during class, so it's going to have to be a private session. But a lot of times, if you have a question, 5 other people have the same question. So please do not feel like it's a stupid question or, whatever, okay? I assure you that if you have a question, other people have the same question. So I am going to introduce myself briefly to show sort of model. So I'm Rabbi Suzanne Singer. I live in Riverside, and I actually grew up in a classical Reform synagogue, which we will talk about towards the end of the series, what classical Reform means. And classical Reform is sort of so almost like going to church that I actually am, in a sense, a Jew by choice also. In other words, I chose to really, embrace my Jewish identity because there's no absolute need to in our modern society. Okay, so Christine, why don't you go first and tell us a little bit about yourself?
My name is Christine Gailey, and I'm a retired professor from UCR, anthropologist. And I've wanted to convert for a long time. Half my family is Jewish, Reform Jews anyway. And to me, Reform Judaism is summed up by when my niece was 5 years old, reciting for her little, religious education class, the story of Moses. And she said, and then the people walked and walked and walked, and they didn't, they 40 years, and then they got to the land of pudding. And that to me just sort of summed up, you're the same idea, it's just different ways of doing it. Okay, so
Thanks.
that's what I like.
That's great, thank you. And by the way, I'm going to ask you to mute yourselves if you're not speaking, just because there's all this echoing and extraneous noise. Roger, why don't you go next? I'm just going on what's on my screen.
Yeah, sure. Okay, my name is Roger Campbell. I live in Alhambra, California. I had a mother who was Jewish, raised Jewish, and my other parent wasn't. So I'm doing this for education, you know, in a spiritual, religious way.
Thank you. Stephen.
Hi, I'm Steven Strauss. Live in San Francisco, California. My dad is Jewish. My mom was not Jewish. I decided to take this class to learn more about Judaism.
Great. Thank you, Stephen. Okay, Bobby and Beverly. Do you know where the mute button is on the bottom left-hand corner? Yeah, there you go.
Yes, I lost a connection. Sorry.
Oh.
Yeah, I'm Bobby Berleffi, and we are in Los Angeles. And I grew up in Wyoming, and it was not the same Wyoming that it is now, to parents who were, my father was very Italian Catholic, and my mother was sort of unprescribed Protestant. And I was raised in the Episcopalian Church. But for most of my life, my mother later converted to Catholicism. But most of my life, I have been surrounded by brilliant, talented Jews. And I finally married one, Beverly. And I recently reconnected with Rabbi Singer. We were colleagues and friends 35 years ago when we were working on a PBS project together. And I felt that it was now or never to really learn. This is a fabulous opportunity to learn about Judaism.
Great. Thanks, Bobby.
I'm Beverly Kopf, and I was raised in an Orthodox Jewish family in Brooklyn. My world collapsed when my brother came out when I was in high school, Yeshiva University High School for Girls. And so I really repressed my own sexuality because I was trying to be a good Orthodox Jew. And then what happened was I came out and it sort of forced me to choose between Judaism and being an openly gay, happy woman. And I chose being an openly gay, happy woman. And I want to reconcile my Judaism and my sexuality.
Great. Thank you so much. Yeah, I used to be a TV producer, so that's how I knew Bobby many, many years ago. Addie?
Hi, I'm Addie. I'm in Houston, Texas, but I was living in Riverside all summer, so that was how I connected with Beth L. And I was raised like Episcopalian, but I have Jewish family, so there's just been like confusion my entire life, and so I'm just trying to learn more about it and like open to the possibility of converting, but also I'm like very young, so just kind of exploring it for myself, I guess. Yeah.
Great. Thanks, Addie. Melissa?
Hello, my name is Melissa Weathers. I am in Riverside down the street from Temple Bethel, and I'm taking this class just to learn more for education.
Great. Thank you. Christine Roberts. See the little icon on the bottom left microphone? If you click on that, or you can hold down your space bar. There you go.
There we go. If I was clicking, it wasn't working. I'm Christine Roberts. I live in Riverside. I'm not Jewish. I'm not really anything. Parents were Episcopal and Foursquare. Amy Simple McPherson was a family friend for my father's family. I'm basically taking the class because I've been studying the Holocaust and teaching about it for many, many years. And I have a dissertation hanging out there unfinished that's on Holocaust literature for children. So I'm hoping this will be the push to get me to finish that, and then also, more information about Judaism.
Great, thank you. Kane.
Hi, I'm Kane. I'm originally from San Diego, but I live in Eastern Washington now. I'm taking this class because 4 years ago, I decided to convert to Judaism, and I've been actively practicing Judaism for the past 4 years, but now this is just kind of the next step in my conversion process.
Thanks. Stacy? Stacy, you're muted. The joys of Zoom. This is one class that I would really much prefer being able to do in person, but go ahead, Stacy.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Stacy Murata. I live in New Jersey, and I am taking this class because I want to convert to Judaism. I was brought up Roman Catholic, and unfortunately, I just lost the faith in the Catholic religion.
Great, thank you very much. Shay.
Hello all, my name is Shay. I was interested in this class due to the fact that I grew up in a Black church in my youth, a Christian church, and I decided to, my political views differed from where I was raised, and it was very difficult to hold on to my faith when I no longer believed in what they believed in. And I started dating Tiffany, who was part of the temple. And you know what? She really turned me on to the services that you guys have. And I really enjoyed those. And I really aligned with what I believe in. So I really want to venture into just learn more about Judaism and, become a better person through this process. So that's why I'm here.
Thank you. David.
Good afternoon. My name is David Neitschel. I'm an attorney in San Diego, and I'm originally from Northern California, but I've lived in San Diego the last 20 years. Both my parents are Jewish, but we never really practiced Judaism, and I just really want to learn more. I have a lot of friends that always ask me about it, and I'm just surprised on how much I don't know. So this is really an introduction for me. And then my girlfriend, Sarah, who's here with me, is also taking the course.
And what's Sarah's story? Sarah, you want to tell us a little bit about yourself?
Hi, I'm Sarah. I live in Redlands, California. That's not too far from you. And yeah, I'm taking this course just to have like a better understanding of the Jewish religion.
Great, great. By the way, by the end of this class, we'll probably know more than most of my congregants, except those who've converted and taken the class. Seriously, most Jews don't know very much, unfortunately. James.
Hi guys, my name is James Southard. I live in Riverside, and I'm taking this course to further my knowledge base in the Jewish religion, as well as the fact that my wife, my stepdaughter are Jewish, and I've always been drawn to the community and the really just everything about it. So I'm looking forward to my conversion process.
Great, thank you. Kim.
Hi, I'm Kim. We're from Riverside. I'm coming from an atheist background and taking this class with the goal of converting.
And
hi, I'm Thomas. I was raised Christian, pretty much am atheist, and just trying to learn a bit more and be supportive of Kim.
Right, I'm glad you're there with her. Brandon.
Hi everybody, I'm Brandon. I live out in San Diego. I'm taking this class because my dad is Jewish and I'm baptized under the Episcopal faith, but the Christian church and I don't get along very well, so I'm trying to learn more about the Jewish faith to see if it's a better faith community for me to fit into, since it's been a bit of a challenge. It's been a bit of friction trying to make the Christian faith work for me, so.
Great. Okay, so we'll have your dad next, Doug.
Hey everyone, I'm Doug, and I live in Rancho Cucamonga. I'm originally from Northern California. Grew up in a mixed household with Judaism and Native American tribal religion, but was mostly with the conservative synagogue until college, and then wound up in a reform and found home. Yay! And ultimately wound up finding, and I'm a proud member of Temple Bethel, taking this class to support our Jewish community, to support my son Brandon, who just spoke. And there's always something amazing to learn from Rabbi Singer. So it's always a great opportunity.
Thank you.
Great to see y'all.
Thank you. Nate.
Howdy, I'm Nate Singer, and I'm living in Los Angeles right now. And I'm taking this because I was raised Christian, but multiple members of my family, including Rabbi Suzanne Singer, are Jewish, and I've gone to a lot of services at the temple, and I've asked my aunt a lot of questions, and I figured it's doing a disservice to not at least take the class and get some more formal education instead of just being on the outskirts.
And he's the only one of my 7 nieces and nephews who is actually doing this, because none of the other ones actually, even though almost all the other ones are actually Jewish, they know nothing. Okay, Linda.
I'm Linda Brown. I live in Riverside, and I'm taking this class to learn more about Judaism.
Great. And did you say that you were a pastor?
I didn't say that part.
Well, I mean, I think, it's admirable. Linda's a pastor, and, she just wants to know more about Judaism.
I'm a Lutheran pastor, but I'm here as a regular person who wants to learn more.
Okay, Sasha.
Hi, I'm in Riverside as well, very close to Temple Bethel. And I think I first met you through Locally Connected, which is an organization that works with refugees. And so I've been really impressed by the activism of Rabbi Singer and the Temple Bethel community. And, I studied religion. I have a background in more the sociology of religion, comparing Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, particularly in the Middle East, in the Palestine-Israel area. And so I have an academic background, but I've never actually studied it with a rabbi. And I just want to learn more,
Great.
improve myself, be a better person.
Wonderful. Thank you. Tammy.
Hi, everybody. I'm Tammy McCoy. I'm a clinical psychologist here in Riverside. You all had such great responses to why you're here. I think this is just the next progression in my life experience. And I'm eager to convert. I come from a family where there's a lot of cultural Judaism. Some of my friends belong to the temple. So here I am beginning that chapter in my journey.
Great. Thank you. Carlos.
Hi, everyone. My name is Carlos, and I discovered this class through Congregation Kolami here in Los Angeles, where I live, who spoke many wonderful things about Rabbi Singer. So I grew up Catholic, and I'm taking this class because I've been thinking about converting, and I guess this is my first official step in that journey.
Congratulations.
Thank you.
Ellie.
Hi, everyone. I'm Ellie. I live in Ranch Cucamonga. I've always been interested and drawn towards the Jewish faith, so call it Shalom, what have you, but I'm just interested in learning more, and I appreciate the books that that were required for this class too. So just learning more, and like everyone else said, just becoming a better and well-rounded person.
Great. Zanny.
Hi, everyone. I'm Xander, or Zanny. I live in Riverside. I'm an English PhD student at UCR. And I guess I technically was baptized Episcopalian, but I grew up with many Jewish friends, and now a Jewish partner. And so I think going to services with their family and just being around it for so long inspired me to start learning more and potentially thinking about converting.
Great. Christina.
Hello, sorry I'm late. I'm Christina. I'm from Southern California, Riverside, but I actually live in Jerusalem, which is why I'm late.
Yeah,
It's
no,
11
and I
p.m.
can't
here.
believe you're actually, isn't it the middle of the night there?
It is. That's why I'm late, because I was asleep and I slept through my alarm. So.
So you're just telling us you're in Jerusalem, and why are you taking the class?
I'm starting my conversion process,
Right.
but I can't complete that here in Israel. I have to do it back in America, and I started attending services at Temple Bethel when I was a student, so I wanted to finish my process where I started.
Right. Yes, this is a little glitch about Israel. So I'll just very briefly say that I've talked to, I think most of you about this, people interested in converting, is that if you convert in the States with a reform or a conservative rabbi, you can move to Israel as an Israeli citizen. They will accept you as an Israeli citizen, as a Jew. However, the rabbinate, the Orthodox rabbinate in Israel, is in charge of weddings. And so the only wedding you can do in Israel that is legal is through a religious, clergy member. So, if you're Catholic, you go to a priest, etc. The only rabbis who are allowed to do legal weddings are the Orthodox rabbis. And they will not consider you Jewish because you didn't have an Orthodox conversion. So if you're already married, not a problem. People who don't either qualify according to the rabbanut, as they're called, or don't want to be married by an Orthodox rabbi, leave the country, go to Cyprus usually, and get married there, and then marriage is accepted. It's insane. Okay, the other thing about conversion is, if you convert here, cool. If you convert in Israel, they won't accept the conversion if it's not an Orthodox conversion. So it's very complicated. Somebody asked me a very good question: is Israel a democracy or a theocracy? And it's kind of a little of both in a certain sense. It's supposed to be a democracy with a parliamentary system, but the ultra-Orthodox control a lot of stuff there. And we'll talk a little bit about that when we get to the class on Israel. Okay, Suzanne.
Okay, I took the Taste of Judaism class almost a year ago with Xander, and I think maybe Ellie was there too for part of it. But this class wasn't offered for almost a whole year, which was a little bit difficult. So now I'm here.
Wonderful. I'm glad you waited that long. Benjamin, you're the one.
Okay. Well, I'm Benjamin Ben Mori. I live down here in Riverside. I've been surrounded by Judaism my whole life. My grandpa's side were a bunch of German Jews who came over from Germany to South America. I grew up with a lot of Jewish friends. I went to temple like 1 or 2 weekends down in Redlands. I've always been interested in connecting with it further and probably converting, but I don't know. I don't want to make any large commitment as of yet.
That's okay. Thank you. Again, no one has to make any commitments whatsoever. If you decide not to do it, it will not hurt my feelings. Okay. So I want to begin today by doing a little bit of comparing Christianity and Judaism. And I'm going to share my screen. We're talking about mitzvah and covenant today. And you will see why. If you have any questions, please feel free to ask them. Let's kind of try to group them in, after I've gone over a few things so that, we can go back and forth between the slides and all of us. So, all right. So the first thing is that the real difference between Christianity and Judaism, and I think the book by Harold Kushner, To Life, does a good job of kind of introducing this. In order to be a Christian, you basically have to accept Jesus as your personal savior and as the Messiah, right? And Jews recognize that Jesus was a Jew, a rabbi, a wise man, but we don't consider him to be a divine being because we don't think that that's possible. We also don't think that he's the Messiah because according to Isaiah, the prophet Isaiah, the Messiah is going to introduce a period of justice and peace. And Jesus came and that did not happen. So we don't believe he's the Messiah. I understand that Christians believe that he will come again, but that is just not part of our understanding. And so the holidays that, are Christian holidays are not holidays for us. We don't practice them. It's not, part of our life. All right, let me move okay. So Judaism begins as a result of the covenantal relationship between God and Abraham. So our sacred literature is what you refer to as the Old Testament. The Old Testament is the Hebrew Bible. It's exactly the same two books, Hebrew Bible or Old Testament. The only difference is the order in which the books appear. So both the Old Testament, quote, and the Hebrew Bible begin with the 5 books of Moses: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. But the prophets, which we have next, are at the end of the Old Testament, because the understanding for Christians is that the prophets are announcing the advent of Jesus. So our prophets are in the middle, and then the writings are at the end, and then there are a few other books that are in a slightly different order. But what's important is that God, according to Jews, has established a relationship with the Jewish people, and this is an agreement of a sort, which we're going to go into more detail about what a covenant is. So the Bible, the Hebrew Bible, represents for us the history, the culture, the language, the theology, and the practices of the Jewish people. So this is another very, very important difference, which hopefully you have or will read in the book To Life. So we do not center our religion on belief, right? So to be, as I said before, to be a Christian, you have to believe that Jesus is your savior. To be a Jew, you don't have to necessarily believe in a whole lot, okay? We all assume that there is one God. But beyond that, it's not about belief. In fact, the whole idea of theology, a whole system by which we connect God and human beings and understand the relationship and all of that, that is not really a Jewish enterprise. There are, of course, ideas about God, and we are going to go through those in a particular session that we have. But those ideas are not necessarily systematic theology. We do find out what the rabbis from our tradition believe about God by looking at what they say in various texts, but they don't really sit down and write up a theology until much later, until like the 20th century, pretty much, when Jews started going to Western universities and started studying philosophy and understanding the whole idea of a systematized belief system. So we are also not just a religion, we are a people. So if we read the Bible, we will see that it's all about how this identity has been created of Israel, a people called Israel. The religion is part of it, but it's also a culture. And to this day, it's a peoplehood. So we are connected by history, by our connection to the land of Israel, by culture. There are all these different elements that connect us to each other. So I'm sure you've met people who are Jewish, who know very little about Judaism. Some of them are in this room. And they're Jewish anyway. If you have a Jewish mother, or you converted to Judaism, you were Jewish, end of story, that's it. In fact, you can't really actually convert out of Judaism. Once you're Jewish, you are Jewish. And so, you don't have to believe anything, know anything. All you have to do is be born to a Jewish mother or convert. So it's very different from Christianity. So Christianity begins with an idea, the incarnation of God in Jesus, the crucifixion and the resurrection of Jesus as a way of redeeming man from sin. This is Harold Kushner's language. If he had written it today, he wouldn't have written man, but that's what he has. Judaism does not begin with an idea, but with a community. It's less about believing and more about belonging. It's less about what we owe God, but what we owe each other, although I would dispute that a little bit. I think we do owe God, but when we owe God, it's how we behave towards other human beings that we owe God, among other things. Because we believe that God cares more about how we treat each other than God does about our theology. In other words, when we go through all the different ideas about God and Judaism, does it really matter which one of these you decide that you're going to incorporate into your system of belief? Not really. It's really much more important how you behave. So the immense importance of seeing the revelation of Sinai as the forming of a covenant and the Torah as the record of that covenant is that it proclaims the idea that God and man have obligations to each other. Again, this was written before you didn't refer to human beings as man. So we have obligations. We owe God something, the obligation to discern and choose the good. Now, I'm not trying to suggest at all that Christianity does not believe that there are ways in which we have to behave. Yes, absolutely. But I'm talking more about the emphasis. So the emphasis here is on how we behave. So many of the rules and rituals of the Jewish way of life are spiritual calisthenics designed to teach to control the most basic instincts of our lives: hunger, sex, anger, acquisitiveness. We're going to talk more about that in a bit, but according to our covenant, there are certain commandments. The word for commandment in Hebrew is mitzvah. And you probably have heard the word mitzvah and think of it as a good deed, because many of the mitzvahs are good deeds. But a mitzvah really means a commandment, and they are supposed to train us to restrain ourselves from behaving like animals and to just give in to whatever our id wants us to do. Okay, Arnold Jacob Wolf. He was a rabbi in Chicago. He's no longer alive. And I love this quote of his. The question, what is a Jew, is both un-Jewish and unproductive. I can think of many better questions. For example, what must I do? What can I become? What does God promise or seek? Jewish theology is a critical analysis of questions more than it is a presentation of answers. For those of you who do not believe or do not like doctrinaire religion, you have come to the right place, because answers are not what we're about. We are about asking questions after questions. And the more questions you ask, the deeper you get into a subject, the more you really understand where you're going. And the Talmud, which we'll talk about it at some point, but the Talmud is one of our sacred books. It's not really a law book. It is discussions about laws. And very often there is no conclusion to the discussion. It would be like looking at a Supreme Court, you know, the decisions with the, or the explanations for the decisions with the dissenting points of view, and having all that conglomerated together without a decision. So we are about questions. We are not about doctrine. One of the greatest problems of modern Judaism is that we have the wrong problems. Is there a God instead of what does God want? What is a Jew instead of how can I become a Jew? The Hebrew Bible consistently prefers narrative to ascriptive theology. In other words, rather than saying you shall or shall not, although yes, there is you shall and you shall not, right? We have the 10 Commandments. You shall not worship other gods. But mostly, if you look at the Torah, right, and the Bible generally, it's stories. And from there, we come to some conclusions. So it's about what we do in the world. God is what God does. The Jew is as the Jew does. This view has practical consequences. It lifts practical theology above systematic theology. In other words, rather than coming up with a whole system to explain what we believe, it's about what we do. Judaism really knows only practical mysticism, practical psychology, surely only practical theology. Theology for us is the art of mitzvah making. It is the poetry of Jewing. Okay, I'm going to stop right now, and I'm going to just see if people have any questions or any comments, anything that is unclear. Yes, Ellie.
When you say Hebrew Bible, do you mean the Torah?
Okay, the Hebrew Bible is what Christians refer to as, and I wish I had a blackboard, and that's usually how I teach, and it's,
yeah,
I don't usually teach with PowerPoint.
Mm-hmm.
And there is, I know there is a thing that you can use for Zoom, but anyway, so the Hebrew Bible is this very exact same thing as the so-called Old Testament. And that includes the Torah, which are the 5 books of Moses, the prophets, and the writings. The writings are like Psalms and Proverbs and those kinds of books. Prophets are Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel. So it's the exact same thing, but in a different order.
Okay.
And there's an acronym for the Hebrew Bible that we use called Tanakh.
Okay.
So that's T-A-N-A-K-H or C-H, depending on how you want to transliterate it. So the T, it's basically an acronym. So the T stands for Torah. The N stands for Nevi'im, which means prophets. And the sound at the end stands for Ketuvim, which means writings. And that is our Hebrew Bible. Oops.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Other questions? I told you there are no questions that are. Yes, I heard someone else.
I was going to say, I believe I have a copy.
Okay. Yeah, okay, you got muted in the middle of what you were saying, but yeah, the Jewish Study Bible, which I suggested that people get for this class, is a really good Bible. It's all in English, so there's no Hebrew in it, but it has good commentary on it. And there's a lot of great Torah commentaries with lots of detailed commentary. For the Bible in general, there's not quite the same amount, but the Jewish Study Bible is a good one. It has some essays, it has some maps, it has a lot of commentary to help you. I would never suggest reading any of the Bible without getting some commentary to go with it so that it can make more sense for you.
I have a question.
Yes, please. Yes, please, Beverly.
So having grown up in an Orthodox family, which is much more doctrinaire, I think my question is, how can a philosophy that seems so non-doctrinaire turn into something that becomes so, rigid?
Well, that's an excellent question. I will try to give an answer, although I don't want to be disrespectful to the ultra-Orthodox.
Right.
But I really do believe that and it's not just my understanding, Judaism has always been a religion of interpretation. I tell people we are not a biblical religion. In other words, we do not follow what it says in the Bible literally, except, thou shalt not murder, steal, I mean, those things, but we don't follow it literally. So we are a rabbinic religion, and I'm going to give you an example. You probably have heard that in the Torah, it says an eye for an eye, right? If I pull out your eye, you get to pull out mine, okay? It was meant literally in those days, because in those days, if I came over and pull out, and I'm talking about thousands of years ago, right? If I came over and pulled out your eye, your family would come over and kill me, and then my family would go kill some of your people, and on and on and on. And the eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth is a way to restrict the amount of vengeance, okay, and retribution.
Right.
Now, the rabbis come along several hundred years into the common era. Are we going to pull each other's eyes out and ears off and, do all this stuff? Of course not. So they really, really believe this, that the Torah was written in such a way as to be interpreted over time. They really believe it. As a matter of fact, they talk about the written and the oral Torah. The written Torah is the Torah, 5 books of Moses. The oral Torah is the interpretation, like in the Talmud. And they say both of them were handed down on Mount Sinai.
No.
So there's somebody who needs to mute themselves. I don't know who it is. So if you could check your, yeah. So the rabbis have given themselves the authority to take what's in the Torah and to translate it and interpret it. And they say, this is what God meant. Okay, so we have interpreted all along. So the eye for an eye, when the rabbis get to this, they go, you know what? It doesn't mean an actual eye for an eye. It means the monetary equivalent of the eye. So for example, if I've pulled out your eye and you are a brain surgeon and I am a street sweeper, you need your eyes more than I do. Or if you're already blind, then my pulling out your eye is not going to make you more blind. So that's not a fair compensation. I mean, they come up with a lot of different arguments for why it's not an actual eye. And then they use some interpretive techniques and rules to say, well, you know, in another place, it says this word and it means money. So in this place, it also means money. So they say it's monetary compensation. It compensates for your medical care, your loss of work, your humiliation, etc. Okay, so it is not an actual eye. And so we have all along interpreted what is in the Torah, what is even in the Talmud, right? Because times change, circumstances change. Now, I think what happened with the Orthodox, now, once upon a time, there was no Orthodox and Reform and Conservative. It was just Judaism. But as we'll learn when we get to the session on Reform Judaism, which is at the end, in the 19th century, the Enlightenment came along and there were Jews who said, hey, you know, let's incorporate the ideas of the Enlightenment into how we understand Judaism. And let's go out there and now we're allowed to be citizens. Let's get out of the ghetto and be part of the larger society. And Orthodox Judaism really was a response to that. And when it's a response, you know, like you had a black president and then you had white supremacy coming out, it's usually regressive in some way, right? So, oh, we're all of a sudden saying there's equality that we could practice in Judaism? You mean a woman can be a rabbi? And so I think the Orthodox, especially there's modern Orthodox and there's ultra Orthodox, there's a lot of different, it's not even one big group, but the ultra Orthodox it's a way to entrench themselves in the past. And so they are very, very stuck in the 19th century, I would say. The big fur hats they wear and the long coats and all that's from 19th century Polish nobility. They still interpret, however. So for example, oh, on the Sabbath, you're not allowed to cook. Well, am I allowed to like get a hot, cup of hot water and put a tea bag in it? I'm allowed to do that. Is that cooking? I'm not allowed to do any kind of work, which we will get into, but am I allowed to pull the tab off a can of Coke? I mean, those are the kinds of questions that it gets very, very specific. But there still is interpretation going on, but it doesn't go in the direction of saying, yes, modern life can be incorporated into how we practice Judaism. I hope that kind of answers your question, Beverly. It's a short, sociological study of what's happened.
I think it actually does.
Okay, good. Brandon and then Christine.
One thing I wanted to, just a quick comment. I got this book, A Christian's Guide to Judaism from Michael Locker as a gift from my parents. And so people that are coming from Christianity taking this class, I think it's a really good read to help out with kind of discerning from a Christian perspective coming into Judaism, as well as the other books that we're reading. Just a little supplementary on the side.
Thank you, Brandon. Yeah, Rabbi Michael Locker is a good friend of mine, and we actually were ordained together. And if you need to find the book somewhere, I can help you find it. Okay, Christine Gailey. I think you're muted. You know, a way to unmute yourself is to press down on your space bar and to keep it down, and then you'll be unmuted without having to find the icon on the screen.
Found it. One of the things I was wondering about as I was doing the readings this week is that it looks, I can't turn off my anthropology. Okay.
Don't.
And one of the things that I was struck by is that that looks like, to me anyway, that the covenant, while it doesn't change, it shifts in different historical circumstances. And that it keeps being brought up in those different historical circumstances, so that there's a kind of living, breathing unfixedness to the tradition, even as you have this kind of continuity. Is that wrong, or is that okay?
Well, there are different kinds of covenants. The next thing I was going to go into was the covenant. So The first covenant that we encounter in the Hebrew Bible or in the Old Testament is the covenant with Noah, right? I will no longer destroy the world by flood. That's my covenant with you. And the sign is the rainbow. The next one, I will now share my screen. So thank you for that transition. That was perfect. The first covenant with a Jew, I'm putting that in quotation marks, because really Judaism doesn't really start until we have a written document that we draw from and interpret. And before that, we're really talking about the Israelite religion, which is practiced with a temple and sacrifices. So Abraham is theoretically the first Jew. So when he was 90 years old, God appeared to Abram. His name is Abram, notice, it's not Abraham yet. And said to him, I am God Almighty, walk before me and be blameless, that I may make my covenant between me and you and may multiply you greatly. Oh, this is supposed to be, Abraham fell on his face. It's not supposed to be Abraham the felon. Okay, Abraham fell on his face and God said to him, behold, my covenant is with you and you shall be the father of a multitude of nations. So here's the deal, right? You're going to obey what I'm going to tell you, and then you will have all these people who will be following you. No longer shall your name be called Abram, but your name shall be Abraham. Now, when I asked a group of little kids, what was added to this name from Abram to Abraham, one of the kids said Ham, which is very cute, but that's actually not the correct answer. So the Hey in Hebrew, which is like the H in English, is basically God's name. So that's what was added in to Abram's name. And Sarah, his wife, whose name was Sarai, becomes Sarah with a Hey as well, or an H. And I will establish my covenant between me and you and your offspring after you throughout their generations for an everlasting covenant. Now notice it's an everlasting covenant. It's never going to stop, although it's a conditional covenant, which we will talk about later. To be God to you and to your offspring after you. And I will give to you and to your offspring after you the land of your sojournings, all the land of Canaan for an everlasting possession, and I will be their God. So when you look at what's going on in Israel and the fighting over the West Bank and whether or not it should be a Palestinian state or it should be part of Israel, the ultra-Orthodox who draw their understanding, even though we're not supposed to be taking all of this literally, they will say, hey, God gave us this land, right? Here it is in black and white. And therefore, that's our land. It is not the land of anybody else. Okay, that's what they're drawing from, even though, as I said, we interpret. Some things they don't interpret. Some things people don't notice that are in the Bible, like it says, stone your disobedient child. Well, when I talked to a evangelical Christian about that, I said, do you believe in that? He goes, well, what are you talking about? That's not in there. Oh, yes, it is. So people, pick and choose what is useful for them. Okay, now what does Abraham have to do in exchange? And God said to Abraham, as for you, you shall keep my covenant, you and your offspring after you throughout their generations. This is my covenant, which you shall keep between me and you and your offspring after you. Every male among you shall be circumcised. You shall be circumcised in the flesh of your foreskins, and it shall be a sign of the covenant between me and you, every male throughout your generations, whether born in your house or bought with your money from any foreigner who is not of your offspring. So everybody has to be circumcised, and that is the trade-off. Now, that was a covenant that was made just with Abraham and Abraham's family. And that's in the book of Genesis. Now we're in the book of Exodus, and this is the covenant that is made with the Israelites all as a people. On the first day of the third month after the Israelites left Egypt, they were slaves in Egypt, they've left, they came to the desert of Sinai. And Israel camped there in the desert in front of the mountain. Then Moses went up to God, and Adonai called to him. Now, Adonai is one of the names of God, which is usually translated in older texts as the Lord. And we don't like to translate it that way because we're trying to get away from, gender-based translations. So Adonai is God's name, which actually means my Lord. So if you put it in Hebrew, you don't notice that it's gendered. Okay, anyway. So Moses went up to God, and Adonai called to him from the mountain and said, "This is what you are to say to the descendants of Jacob, and what you are to tell the people of Israel. You yourselves have seen what I did to Egypt, and how I carried you on eagle's wings and brought you to myself. Now, if you obey me fully and keep my covenant, then out of all nations you will be my treasured possession. Although the whole earth is mine." And by the way, here is Moses. And there is light coming from his head, but of course, drawn this way, it looks like he has horns, thus the stereotype of Jews having horns. But they're not horns. It's not even supposed to be like two straight lines like that. It's just when he came down from Mount Sinai with the Torah and the 10 Commandments, he was radiating light. And that's how it got drawn. As I said, that's what led to the unfortunate stereotype. So you will be for me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. These are the words you are to speak to the Israelites. This is what God is saying to Moses. So Moses went back and summoned the elders of the people and set before them all the words Adonai had commanded him to speak. The people all responded together, "We will do everything Adonai has said." So Moses brought their answer back to Adonai. When Moses, and then we skip to another chapter, when Moses went and told the people all Adonai's words and laws, they responded with one voice, "Everything Adonai has said, we will do." Moses then wrote down everything Adonai had said. By the way, they're lying. They don't do everything that God told them to do, but you know, that's a nice idea. Okay, I'm gonna come back. So those are the first two covenants with anybody who's, you know, Jewish. The third one is with King David. And that covenant is that the throne will never depart from the line of King David. It did, but that was supposed to be the promise. So let me come back to the group and see if anybody has questions about that. The covenant is, you know, something that we agree to. And not only do we agree to it, so you have to understand again that interpretation is very important in Judaism. And what the rabbis do is they look at the text very, very closely. And depending on what letter might be missing or an extra letter, or, I mean, there are all these different things that are problems in the text, and they look at that as an opportunity to interpret. So when the Israelites are standing at Mount Sinai, the expression in Hebrew to say they're at the foot of Mount Sinai is tachtav, which means technically, literally underneath it. So here are two interpretations. One is a very nice one, that as God was holding the mountain over the heads of the Israelites, that is sort of like the wedding chuppah. And the Torah is the wedding contract, the ketubah. So that's when Israel and God got married. The one that isn't so nice, that really takes further interpretation because it's too upsetting otherwise, is that God held it over the heads of the Israelites and said, "If you accept my Torah, all will be well. If not, I'm going to drop it on your heads." So, wow. That's a problem, right? That's coercive. So another way to understand that, which I got from a French philosopher named Emmanuel Levinas, is that, I have to say the very, very annoying thing about Zoom is that you have to stare at yourself all day long. And I'm going to stare at you guys for a bit because I'm really tired of seeing myself. Okay. So what Levinas says is, the Torah gives us a blueprint for a moral, ethical world. And if we don't obey this blueprint, if we do not follow these moral laws, the world is going to fall into chaos. Hey, guess what? That's what's happening around us, right? We have not followed ethical laws, whether it's Jewish, Muslim, I don't care which. And we've allowed the society to be pretty broken. And so that's how the rabbis understand the Torah, that it is an essential component of our lives. And if we do not follow it, the world becomes chaos. And that's the notion of having the mountain drop on people's heads. But the idea here is that this is something we are committed to before we're even born, before we become Jews by choice. There's also a passage in Deuteronomy where it says, you are standing here this day, because there's a repetition of what already happened at Mount Sinai. There's going to be a repetition of it in Deuteronomy. And Moses says, you are standing here today, not just those who are here today, but those who are not here today, which means anybody in the future. Again, any child, grandchild, whatever of a Jew, and anybody who joins our group. So we're all pre-committed to the Torah, whether we like it or not, which, you know, could be problematic, but at the same time, we know the consequences of not following the rules. Okay, any discussion, any questions? Okay, Kane, please.
Yeah, so my question was about Abraham's covenant, and
mountain just fell down.
I was doing my own research. So I know that Abraham made his covenant with God by circumcising, but when the Israelites had escaped Egypt and were in the desert, they were not circumcising. Is that because they had not received the Torah yet, or is that for another reason?
That is a very good question. First of all, of course, they hadn't received the Torah yet. And they were in Egypt. They've been in Egypt for 400 years. Now, there is a midrash that's, this mountain that I created keeps falling. Okay, I'm putting it somewhere else. So the Israelites were in Egypt for about 400 years. And so it's very possible that, what do they know about keeping the covenant or about circumcising themselves? Although there is a midrash that says that they actually did keep certain mitzvahs, you know, even though they hadn't gotten the Torah yet. So it just depends on which rabbi you ask. But there's also this notion that there is no before or after in the Torah. Very convenient. So for example, there is a scene in Genesis where Abraham, in fact, right after this scene that I read to you, he gets circumcised. And he's sitting, kind of recovering from his circumcision in his tent. And there are 3 strangers who come along who happen to be messengers of God, but he doesn't know that at that point. And he greets them. He washes their feet because the desert is hot and your feet get really hot and dry. He washes them. And then he gets his wife to make a beautiful dinner, which combines milk and meat, which you're not supposed to combine milk and meat. That's actually not even in the Torah. That is in the Talmud later on. Because all it said, and again, this is how we do interpretation. What it says in the Torah is you cannot boil a kid in its mother's milk. Not a kid like a child, but a goat, right? You can't boil a kid in its mother's milk. You don't want to combine death and birth together. They are really, you know, OCD started with the guys who wrote the Torah, okay? They don't like mixing things. You can't mix wool and linen. You can't harness 2 different kinds of animals to a yoke. You can't, you know, grow things that are different in the same field. I mean, they're really into things being in their place. Okay. So, okay, now I lost my train of thought. What was I talking about? Somebody please remind me, what was I talking about?
You were saying that you cannot boil a kid
Oh, yes,
in
thank you.
its mother's milk.
Yeah, you can't boil the kid in its mother's milk. Thank you so much. Okay, so the Talmud interprets that to mean you can't mix milk and meat. Yeah, so that's even way later from the Torah. Well, the rabbis are looking at the story of Abraham, who is preparing this meal of milk and meat. How could he do that? There's a prohibition against that. Well, of course he didn't know about that because this is way before that rule came along. But Rashi, who is one of our big commentators, the 12th century French commentator, says there's no before or after in the Torah. So he already knew about all these rules. And he waited the requisite number of hours between serving one and the other. Okay, that's how Midrash works. You will see as you go through this that interpretation, the people who interpret have a lot of chutzpah. They really go far afield sometimes. And they really believe that they are entitled to do that. Absolutely entitled. So I'll tell you one story about interpretation. So with the Talmud, and we're going to go more into Jewish texts at a later time, but with the Talmud, majority rules. So you have, however number of rabbis sitting there ruling on something, and the majority rules. So the rabbis are having a discussion about an oven. It's called the oven of Aknai. Aknai is a snake. So this is an oven that has different layers of, like, one is whatever, clay, and then another layer of something else. And the question is it kosher or not? And I don't remember which way it goes. It doesn't matter. So let's say the majority says it's kosher. And Rabbi Eliezer, who's the one who's the strictest about how you interpret, says, no, it's not. And they say, majority rules. He goes, okay, I'll tell you what, if I'm right, let this tree fall over. And the tree falls over. And they go, we don't care. That's not going to convince us of anything. So he says, okay, if I'm right, let this river go backwards. And the river goes backwards. And they say, we don't care. That doesn't convince us. A voice from heaven comes down and says, the law is with Rabbi Eliezer. And they say, we don't care. It is now in our hands. Majority rules. And the next scene is God laughing, saying, my children have defeated me. My children have defeated me. Now, of course, this is written by the rabbis, but they're basically saying, hey, you know what? Prophecy doesn't exist anymore. It's been put in our hands. We need to decide, and majority decides. And so now for legal interpretation, they use a series of rules about how they're going to interpret. They don't just do willy-nilly. But when it comes to stories, and I'll give you one. So Jacob and Esau, you may know about these two guys. They don't get along too well. They're twins. They fight even starting in their mother's womb. So as you probably know, Jacob steals the birthright of the firstborn. He steals the blessing of the firstborn, and then he has to escape because Esau's threatened to kill him. And he goes to his father-in-law, becomes his father-in-law, his uncle, and he marries a bunch of women, he has a bunch of kids, he's got a lot of property. He comes back 20 years later and he encounters Esau. Now, in the text of the Torah, what happens is he's really scared, Jacob. Like, Esau's wanted to kill him last time they came along. So, what's going to happen? Well, they meet and Esau kisses him. Well, above the word to kiss in Hebrew, in the Torah, there are 6 dots. Now, it's very possible that the scribe splattered his ink across there. I don't know where those 6 dots came from, but the rabbis say those 6 dots have to be interpreted. And the interpretation is that he did not kiss his brother, he bit him. And the way they do that is that the word for kiss and the word for bite they're very close words in Hebrew. That's what they do, and they feel perfectly entitled to doing that. So you see, Christine Roberts.
The conflation that I see between, living on land versus owning, and how those shift through time interpreted, and between the people and a state, which seems to be mixed, especially in modern times, a great deal. And so as a scholar of state formation, this just makes me absolutely amazed at watching a process of state formation.
Well, what's interesting is that what the Torah says is that we do not own any of that land. We are renters.
God owns
the land. We're renters. We've got to take good care of it. And guess what? We haven't.
Yeah, but the other thing is the person that I'm most familiar with about overinterpretation and the way that interpretation can lead to absurdity is Isaac Bashevis Singer. And in his wonderful book of children's stories called Zlati the Goat and Other Stories, he has this group of elders, including a rabbi, from Chelm.
Yes.
Who keep interpreting things to the point of utter nonsense.
Well,
Okay?
I think it's a satire.
Yes, I know it is. I mean, it's hilarious.
Yes, it is.
But I think it's his critique of this kind of rabbinic,
Yes.
over authority.
Yes. Now, I will admit that the rabbis there's something called Daf Yomi where you study one page of the Talmud every day, and it takes 7 years to get through the whole thing.
Yeah.
Because a page of the Talmud, as we'll see, has a lot of commentary on it, so you have to read all the commentary. And I'm doing a very brief version of that. I don't have the time to read a page of Talmud every day. But oh my God, we just went through a tractate called Eruvim, which an Eruv is a sort of limit that you put around a neighborhood because you're not allowed to take from private to public,
right,
or public to private. And this way you create a private space where you can carry things. Okay. Anyway, the point is, oh my God, they look at every possibility. What if there's a garbage heap that is the edge of the Eruv? Or what if it's the ocean? Or what if it's insane. So they do go way, but what it is, it's really more about how to think.
Yeah.
It's really more how to think. It's not, this is a rule that we really need to know, like, oh, there's a garbage dump, so how do we consider this? It's really more, if you take a proposition, how can we take it in one direction or another, and where does it lead us? It's really more about that process than anything else. But you're right, it gets kind of insane. But I think, did Christine Roberts have a question or a comment?
Christine?
I had one.
Okay, Bobby.
Okay, I'll attempt this. Because you started by saying Judaism is not a system of beliefs.
Right.
It's more of practice.
Right.
And but I guess I wanted to ask you what the difference is between rules versus beliefs, because there seem to be rules that have changed over the ages, and how that isn't a belief. I studied Mormonism. I mean, I did a documentary on the Mormons at one point, and they had revelation from a prophet who would change basically their beliefs and their rules.
Well, let's put it this way. The first, the 10 Commandments are different for Christians and Jews. For Jews, the first commandment is, I am God. So that's weird because that doesn't sound like a commandment. But the most basic belief you have to have is that God commanded you to do these things. Otherwise, there's absolutely no reason to do them, right? Unless you think, yeah, they're a good idea. So there is that belief, but there is not, the rest of it is sort of rules for behavior rather than I believe that Jesus is my savior, or that Jesus is the Son of God, or any of those things. And I can't go into more detail, but I'll tell you one thing. A friend of mine became a Methodist minister, and in order to do that, she had to defend her theology.
Yeah.
I did not have to do that. I wrote a thesis. And I did take a class, and it wasn't even called theology. It was called Medieval Jewish Thought and Modern Jewish Thought. It was not called theology. But I was asked to write a paper, which was my theology, and I called it fragmented theology because I draw from a lot of different places and they're not necessarily consistent. So that's how we end up, not really being about theology. That doesn't mean we don't have certain beliefs, but it's not as fundamental to the religion as it is to Christianity, and it's more than a religion anyway. If you eat bagels in the morning, that could be your way of being Jewish, I don't really recommend that, but I have many family members who, that's about as much as they do. Okay.
What do you
Can I ask one more question?
Yeah.
Because I'm getting so worked up right now because it's like my childhood is flashing before my eyes in not a good way, because there's so much pain and hurt that comes from this interpretation. It's really a question of interpretation, but that's not explained to you when you're growing up, And so I guess my question is, it's like, can't these are there still rabbis? Like, is there a Reformed rabbi who's still interpreting for like?
Oh yeah, absolutely. So for example, okay,
I know you together. Why don't the rabbis, the Orthodox, the conservative, why don't they just kind of get together and come up?
Are you serious?
I don't know. It would make
the Orthodox don't even think we're really, I mean, they think we're Jews because they can't deny it, but they don't think we're practicing Judaism. They certainly don't recognize me as a rabbi. And forget it.
But that's crazy.
So here's the thing. So, okay, so it says in Leviticus 18 that for a man to lie with another man, the way you lie with a woman is an abomination, right? That's where your Orthodox people judge your brother and you.
Right.
Okay, so Reform says this was written a long time ago. Okay, so let me preface all of this by saying we don't believe that God wrote the Torah in Reform Judaism, okay? We believe that human beings wrote it. They were inspired by God and they were inspired by a lot of other things, but it's human beings. Now, the problem with that is, what is the authority? As I said before, if you don't believe that God gave you these commandments, why would you follow them, right? The authority is missing. And if I say this is what you should do, no one's going to listen to me unless they think, yeah, she's got some good ideas. If I'm an Orthodox rabbi, say, here's what you have to do, they're going to do it because I'm speaking on behalf of God, right? So the Reform movement says, and what I say when I have a difficult text like that one in particular, but also in Deuteronomy, it basically says, wipe out the 7 Canaanite nations, literally wipe them out, okay? Ethnic cleansing. Okay, so I have 3 strategies for that. One is I problematize the text. It is a problem to have that text in our sacred literature, period. We all have problematic texts in our literature. And I don't want to make like it's not there. I don't want to ignore it. I don't want to, go to synagogue and like that week, we're just going to skip over the Torah portion. It's there. Number 2, historicize it. This was written a long time ago. Now, there's still some cultures that, believe in ethnic cleansing, obviously. But this document was written thousands of years ago. And that's not how we understand the formation of a new country anymore, at least people who are enlightened, right? Or woke. And the third thing is not to take it literally. Okay, so for example, a gay rabbi interpreted this for me as, you lie with a woman as a man, it's a power relationship sometimes, right? It's not necessarily a mutual relationship, and that's what's not okay. Okay. And I don't think they conceived in those days of a loving relationship between 2 men or 2 women. So yes, we have reinterpreted this and we've said, we ordain people who are gay, we ordain people who are trans, we are welcoming of people however they understand themselves. That is not the case in Orthodoxy. As I said, it's a response to Reform. Okay, last one. Christine Roberts, did you have something you wanted to say?
I did. Obviously, if you're circumcised, that is a clear distinction between most of the population, certainly at that time. But has there ever been any interpretation as to why that had to be chosen or was chosen as the sign of the covenant? And even though it was patriarchal society, was there ever an equivalency for women where later God supposedly had made a covenant that included women?
Okay, I'm going to answer that just very briefly because we're doing that next week.
Well, that's okay. Then I can wait.
But yeah, there's no equivalent, thank God, and for women, and it actually was practiced by other people. Oh. And it's very interesting that of all the different mitzvahs that were jettisoned by the Reform movement, that one wasn't. And I think there's something very primal about it. But we'll discuss it more next week. So I want to go on to the next bit of material. We're in a covenant with God, so we're expected to use our powers for good and righteousness. We're called to pursue justice. That's really the message of the prophets. And it can kind of almost be summarized in this statement by the prophet Micah. God has told you what is good and what the Lord requires of you, only to do justice and to love mercy and to walk humbly with your God. That's it. That's what it really comes down to. And Leviticus 19. So interestingly, we have Leviticus 8. Well, Leviticus, the book of Leviticus is really mainly about the sacrificial system at the temple, about bringing in animals and sacrificing them. Then we have that lovely passage in Leviticus 18 about not lying, man not lying with another man, the way you would lie with a woman. But then we have this whole holiness code. We are enjoined to care for the stranger, the widow, and the orphan. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. Now, I've heard people say, this is the golden rule that was made up by Jesus. No, this is in Leviticus. Jesus interpreted this. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. He said, do unto others as you would have them do to you. But this is an interpretation of this verse. Now, here's how Jews have interpreted it. So this is from the Talmud. It'll give you a little example of some of the stuff that's in the Talmud. A non-Jew came before Rabbi Shammai and said to him, I wish to convert to Judaism. Please tell me all the Torah while I stand on one foot. All right, what does it mean to tell me the whole Torah while I stand on one foot? Somebody please unmute and tell me what that means.
To do it quickly or briefly.
Yes, it's give me the Cliff Notes. I don't want to spend, a year doing this. Because standing on one foot, unless you've done a lot of yoga, you can't get much out. Well, Shammai is a tough guy. And he says, get it, push the man away with, he's got some, instrument in his hands. I'm not going to waste my time with you. That's completely insulting. Now, Hillel and Shammai are two sages, and there's a lot of this in the Talmud. There are two guys who argue with each other. That's wonderful. They argue for the sake of heaven. It is a wonderful thing for there to be argument and disagreement, and they respect each other for it. Now, guess who won most of the arguments? Hillel, because have you ever heard of a Shammai house on a UC campus or on any campus, right? You've only heard about Hillel houses. So Shammai gets kind of forgotten. So the same guy goes before Hillel, these are two rabbis, and says the same thing. And Hillel decides to meet the guy where he's at. You want it in one quick, dose? What is hateful to you, do not do to any person. Now that is his interpretation of you shall love your neighbor as yourself, which is very different from Jesus's version. Jesus says, do unto others as you would have them do to you. And this guy says, what is hateful to you, do not do to any person. So he says that is the whole Torah. That's really what the Torah is there to teach us. All the rest is commentary. Now go and learn it. In other words, he meets him where he's at. And then he says, okay, you asked for it. I gave it to you. Now you go do what you're supposed to do, which is to study. I love that. Okay. Okay, so here's something else that Rabbi Hillel says. Hillel is a, very famous rabbi in our tradition. This is one of my favorite sayings. If I am not for myself, who is for me? So Judaism is not about self-denial, martyrdom. I have to take care of myself. I have to look out for myself. Okay, that's really important. But if I'm for myself only, what am I? So if I'm only going to worry about myself, I'm a selfish, narcissistic person. And if not, now when? In other words, there's a lot of work to be done, in this world. Go and do it now. Don't wait. So I think this is really important. And I've quoted this to many people who end up doing too much for someone else to the point where they've forgotten their own health and their own welfare. This is really a nice summary of, if you want to call it, beliefs in Judaism, that we do have a responsibility to ourselves. I'm going to show you a few examples of some mitzvahs. Now, there are traditionally 613. Okay. So and by the way, you can go to Wikipedia and you can get all of them if you want to know, but I'm just going to give you a few examples. So the first set here are about God. We have to know that there's God, right? Can't have other gods. That God is one, that we're supposed to love and fear God, that we're supposed to sanctify God's name. Okay. Then here's a bunch about prophets. Prophets, of course, they don't exist anymore, but when they did, we were supposed to, basically listen to the prophet. We're supposed to love other Jews. We're supposed to love converts. We're not supposed to hate our fellow. To reprove wrongdoers. In other words, you do not stand idly by the blood of your neighbor. You have to do something. You have to speak up. And you have to reprove them. In other words, that was not a right thing to do. Now, but you're not supposed to embarrass them. So I think somebody needs to mute themselves because I'm hearing an echo. Thank you. So when you want to reprove somebody and say, hey, you've done something wrong, you don't do it in public. You do not call people out in public. You take them aside and you gently talk to them. And you also ask yourself, why am I doing this? Am I doing this because I want to show that I'm better than this person? Or am I doing this because, I really feel like this is the right thing to do? We don't oppress the weak. We're not supposed to gossip. Gossiping is one of those things that is considered as awful, just about as murder. Because once you gossip about somebody, the cat's out of the bag and you can't get it back in. Oop. You're not supposed to bear a grudge. You're supposed to learn Torah, right? A rapist is supposed to marry the woman that he raped. Okay, this is in the Torah, right? Now, that sounds horrible. It is. On the other hand, in those days, and still today in certain places, if a woman gets raped, she is damaged goods and no one's going to marry her. So at least she gets a husband, whatever. Oh, sorry. Very sensitive thing here. Okay. Now, divorce, it says he's not supposed to divorce her, but actually the divorce is only in the hands of the husband. And that's something we'll talk about when we get to marriage. The woman suspected of adultery goes through a whole ritual to see whether or not she really committed adultery. And this is just based on the suspicion of the husband. He suspects her of adultery. And even though it's a horrible ritual, she has to go, they have to go before the priest, and the priest takes some dirt and puts it in some water and mixes it up, and then takes some stuff that he's written God's name on a piece of parchment or whatever and sticks it in there, and then she has to drink it. The fact is, this is a way to neutralize the husband, because generally she's not going to, react to the potion the way she would if she were really an adulterer. And so at least it gives a cooling off period to the husband, but then you have to go back and live with the guy, but that's another story. Okay. Here's some stuff that's related specifically to the offerings at the temple. You don't put oil on the meal offering. You don't put frankincense on the meal offering, whatever. You're not supposed to have sexual relations with your mother. You're not supposed to eat non-kosher animals, etc. You see, now we're already at 285 because there's so many. But every 7 years, you're supposed to release people from their loan obligations so that nobody ends up being completely impoverished. Hey, that would be something that'd be interesting to apply to the US society, right? In fact, during the Jubilee year, which is 50 years in, everybody gets their land back. So nobody's supposed to be completely impoverished, and no one's supposed to accumulate that much wealth. Since people are released from their loans in the 7th year, there's a fear that people might not want to loan money right before the 7th year because they might not get paid back, but it says you're supposed to lend money anyway. The Sanhedrin was the highest body, running the Jewish community. So they have things they're supposed to see. There's the 50th year, the Jubilee year. You blow the shofar on the 10th of Tishrei, which is a month when Yom Kippur is going to happen, and you free the slaves. A Kohen is a high priest. So he's not supposed to be drunk when he enters the temple. He's not supposed to have long hair. He's not supposed to have torn clothing. He should not leave the temple in the middle of the service. That would be pretty weird. And you just look at some of these things and we'll talk about what they are afterwards. Okay, so before we go into what a mitzvah is, I just want to point out, what do you notice about some of these commandments? Do they all apply to today? No, right, Shay? Half the commandments just about are about the temple service in Jerusalem. Now, we don't have a temple in Jerusalem anymore. So there are a whole bunch of commandments about how do you bring the sacrifices. You can't put oil on the meal offering. You can't do this. You can't do that, blah, 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 right? So if you want to follow the commandments, you can't follow all of them, even if you wanted to, right? Because too many of them are about the temple service. Some of them are sexist. If somebody rapes me, I don't want them to marry me. Thank you very much. You know, so you have to take this idea of following the commandments with a grain of salt. Like, you know, Beverly, is Beverly there? You can repeat this to her. All these commandments that the Orthodox say you're supposed to follow, you can't follow a lot of them, even if you wanted to, right? So that's something to keep in mind. Now let's see what a mitzvah really is. All right, mitzvot is the plural. It's a set of values, and it's a life of discipline, right? Before I eat, I say a blessing. That gives me a moment to be very intent, and you know, that I have intention. I'm going to be eating something and I need to think about it. Oh, wait a minute. This food I should be grateful for. And somebody was out there, you know, doing something like, you know, plowing the land so that I could have this food. And somebody was out there picking the vegetables and the fruit and, you know, really beating hot weather. So it gives you a moment to be grateful, to acknowledge. And you also, because you follow, let's say, the kosher laws, you don't end up eating anything. You have to think about what you're eating. Let's see, I know I can't eat pork. I can have this. I can't eat shellfish, but I can have salmon. So it gives you much more intentionality in what you do. So it's a life of discipline. And in the Talmud, it says, be quick in carrying out a minor commandment, as in the case of a major one. For one good deed leads to another, and one transgression leads to another, right? So in other words, if I do a good deed, even if it's a really small one, and a good deed being a mitzvah, which is a commandment, if I do it, I'm more likely to do another good one. But if I transgress, it gets easier and easier to transgress. So for example, in the story of Passover, the Pharaoh is asked to please let my people go, right? And Pharaoh says no. He hardens his heart. And he hardens his heart the first 5 times, but after that, God hardens his heart. Now that's a problem because you go, God did it? Now a traditional commentary would say God did that to show how strong and big God was, because the more Pharaoh hardened his heart, the more God could show off all the wonderful marvels that God could do. But Eric Fromm, who was a psychologist, said, it's not that God did it, it's that if you keep doing something a certain way, it's going to get harder and harder for you to change. So you act like a jerk over and over again, and you get to the point where you can't be a jerk, you can't stop being a jerk anymore. So you try to do a good deed and keep doing another good deed. Okay, so here let's look at, for example, the kosher laws. What does God care whether a person kills an animal in the proper Jewish way and eats it? So the kosher laws include killing the animal in the most humane way possible. So does God care about that? How about if I strangle the animal? Or how about if I pull the leg off and eat, you know, I guess the Canaanites did that. They would pull a leg off an animal while it was still alive. And you're not allowed to do that in Jewish law. Where does God care whether a man eats or non-kosher animal, right? Does God really care about that? The commandments were given only to refine God's creatures. As it says, God's word is refined. It's a protection to those who trust in God. In other words, it's for our purpose. It helps us be more disciplined. It helps us be better people. And frankly, even though a lot of the mitzvot seem like they're ritual, they actually, more often than not, contain some moral element to them. So for example, you're supposed to follow Shabbat laws. Like on Shabbat, you're not supposed to work and all that. And we'll talk more about that during our session on Shabbat. But You're also supposed to give your servant and your animal a break. And if you take the day off from doing all that work, maybe you'll develop some gratitude for the world because you'll be sitting there enjoying the world in a way that you don't normally do because you're too busy doing everything else that you're doing. So they benefit us in a number of different ways. Judaism's commandedness and the discipline it implies create a constancy of awareness. Without commandments, we are like those who have no needs. But with commandments, we become like those who are hungry, constantly seeking sources of food, ways to satisfy our appetites. People who are hungry are always aware of their need for food. Similarly, Jews who feel commanded by mitzvot have a heightened spiritual awareness. Ultimately, the discipline of mitzvah creates an appetite for spiritual sensitivity that Judaism cannot otherwise provide. If Judaism's quest for spirituality is a process of working slowly toward a relationship with God, then the daily content of Jewish life has to reflect that. In other words, if we want a relationship with God, however we understand God, or if we want a spiritual life, we have to develop ourselves spiritually. And that means being more aware of the moment, being more aware of the blessings that we have in our lives, being more aware of God's presence, and the mitzvot are supposed to help us achieve that. With other human beings, building and maintaining relationships requires the commitment of regular behaviors. Though we rarely use such terminology, maintaining human relationships involves commandedness. Judaism suggests that relationship with God requires no less. In other words, we have a responsibility to God and to ourselves and to the people in our community. And this is how we discipline ourselves to have that kind of commitment. Okay, mitzvah is what a Jew ought to do in response to God and to the tradition of our people. This response comes from personal commitment rather than from unquestioning obedience. See that? Personal commitment rather than from unquestioning obedience to a set of commandments, which past tradition thought to be the direct will of God. So if you're Orthodox, you do it because God said so. If you're Reform, it doesn't mean you don't do it. And it doesn't mean you do it because God said so. It means you are supposed to, actually, this is the ideal. You were supposed to understand what these mitzvahs are about and study them, and then decide which of them you feel will be something that speaks to you, and you make a personal commitment to that. So that's very different from how the Orthodox understand commandments. Because again, if we don't believe that the Torah was written by God, then why would we decide to do something? By making choice and commitment part of our plan of life, we willingly and purposely strengthen our bonds with the God of Israel and with our people. Mitzvah is therefore more than folkway and ceremony. As we choose to do a mitzvah, be it positive act or a negative act, we choose the way of duty, of self-discipline, and of loyalty. To do so with eagerness and joy is a true seal of Shabbat observance. The first time I taught this class, we did Shabbat. That was our first one. And because, again, it's Reform, and we're not saying you have to do it this way or that way, the suggestion in a book that was written and published by the Reform movement was, hey, you know, it's the intention that is important. It's not the actual act. So how about if you go to a museum? And that gives you the spiritual fulfillment that you need to carry on your life. It gives you an appreciation of the world and God. Maybe that's what you should be doing, is going to a museum. Maybe going to services doesn't speak to you. Now, frankly, I don't think that they would publish the same book today. This was, 20, 30 years ago. And the Reform movement has gotten a little more traditional. But I think it's something to keep in mind in terms of, what is the purpose of a mitzvah? And if the purpose of the mitzvah is to enhance the way you behave in the world and how much you want to be conscious of God and how much you want your spiritual life to be alive, then maybe you don't do it exactly the way that all our ancestors have done it. Okay, let's just take a moment. Anybody have questions?
I have a interesting, it was years and years and years ago at one of the shuls up in the Bay Area, and the rabbi was talking about why do you do what you do and why do we do what we do? And everyone was kind of making, and said, when it comes to, when it comes to the mitzvot, when it comes to how you engage in your world, if you don't know why you do it, then that's something you should consider tossing out and leave room and space to be able to do that which is with intentionality. Because and he brought everything back to Shema, to Shema, and to recognizing, of listening and being present and actually engaging with the bigger, broader community. And he encouraged everyone in there, regardless of what they did, and to ask yourself why. It was so funny because a woman who was next to me kind of muttered over to me, nobody ever asked me why I do something. Why would I don't have time to think about that. There's too many things to think about. And I will never forget that. I was probably about 18 or 19 when this entire thing took place. And it was, but there's so much, I think. And when I think of my friends who are Orthodox, or I think of my friends who are conservative, I think there's so much that they go through that if I ask them why, they go, oh, I just do whatever. And then they ask me why, and I give them whatever the reason is. And they go, wow, really? Like, you've spent time thinking about it, because it comes back to that intentionality. It comes back to that connection. And it's, I always go back to that thing of asking why, and this woman really going, I don't know, I don't have time in my life to ask why.
So, I don't want to trash the Orthodox, but if you've ever gone to an Orthodox service, people mumble their prayers very quickly, in Hebrew on their own. And you wonder how much intentionality there is there, and how much kavanah, which is, intention. So in Reform, what we say is you should study what is available and decide what works for you. And Rosenzweig, who was a philosopher in the 20th century, who had almost converted to Christianity, when he was asked whether he laid tefillin are those wooden boxes leather boxes that you strap on your head and on your arm. I can explain what that is at another time, but he said, not yet. In other words, maybe one day that'll be meaningful to me. It isn't right now, but I'm going to keep trying. I think someone else had a comment. Christine?
What happens when one mitzvah contradicts another? And so, you're not supposed to rebuke someone, blah, blah, blah. But by not calling them out, they can do more harm. And I'm thinking of today's circumstances, of course. And so I think that the mindfulness, which is how I'm interpreting.
Yes, mindfulness, that's the word.
Is that why you're prioritizing one or the other. And so, you don't do it with maliciousness. You do it in order for the protection of the greater good.
Right. Well, I didn't mean to say you shouldn't rebuke. You are supposed to rebuke people, but you're not supposed to do it in a way that's humiliating.
That's it. Well, that's fine.
So you kind of have to balance those things out.
Yeah.
Okay. I want to, since we're going to run out of time, I want to make sure I go to the last few slides. So now a mitzvah is a commandment. So it's not so much how I feel about it at any given time. So once you decide I am going to follow a particular commandment, you do it, right? Now, let me give you a very good example, which is tzedakah. Now, tzedakah is often translated as charity. But charity means I see a homeless person and I feel sorry for them and I give them whatever it is, a quarter, $1, whatever. But today I'm not in the mood. I'm not in the mood. I don't want to even deal with it. So I'm not going to give you money. That is charity. A mitzvah of tzedakah, which is actually from the word that means righteousness, is I don't care if you're in the mood or not. You do it because it's the right thing to do. And by the way, the rabbis say you should always give something to a beggar. Because what happens is if we don't, we start not even seeing them anymore. The first time we might feel a little bit guilty, and then the next time, and eventually you don't see them anymore. But the point is tzedakah, charity, whether it's, giving money to a beggar or a homeless person, or, participating in a social justice matter or giving money or whatever it is, these are not things that are about our mood. It is about what is the right thing to do, and you do it. And it's not always convenient or easy. You know, being a Jew, if you really want to be a Jew and not just eat a bagel once in a while, you make commitments to a number of things and you need to stick to them. And that's not as easy as just being nothing, right? The performance of mitzvot ought to be the pattern of one's life. The more deep-rooted such a pattern, the more intense and regular one's performance of mitzvot, the richer and truer will be one's life as a Jew. Do not become discouraged because the manual, this is the Shabbat manual where they said you could go to the museum, contains mitzvot, which you cannot now fulfill. The secret of observing a mitzvah is to begin. So for example, you want to try to observe Shabbat. Well, am I ready to spend 24 hours really observing Shabbat? Maybe not. How about if I start with an hour? And next week, it'll maybe be 2 hours. And then maybe in a month, it'll be half a day. And maybe by the end of the year, I'll do a whole day of Shabbat. You know, you have to work towards these things. They don't all just happen in one fell swoop. It's a big commitment. And you know what? If you don't, one day you violate the laws of Shabbat, okay, you know, it's not the end of the world, but you're at least trying to do that. So the idea here is that these mitzvot are supposed to make your life richer and truer. It's not like the more Jewish I am, the more I'll believe in God. No, the more Jewish I am, the more I will perform the mitzvot. Now I want to end with this concept because we talked about covenant, but we didn't really define what covenant is. A covenant is different from a contract. A contract is, I'm going to have you build a fence for me. I pay you when it's done and we part company. Unless, of course, I have to sue you, but that's another story. Okay. A covenant is everlasting. And this is this beautiful way in which Walter Brueggemann, who's a Christian theologian, describes what a covenant is. In distinction from the conventional model, God in the covenantal traditions of the Old Testament is a free partner, not locatable or predictable. That's important too, is that God is not a you know, even though a lot of what it says in Deuteronomy is if you obey my commandments, all will be well. If not, you'll, you know, be in trouble. The fact is, we know the world doesn't work that way. So we can't just say, oh, I'm going to obey my commandments and therefore God will never do anything bad to me. No, God is not that kind of God, okay? There might be some other things going on. So God is a free partner. And so are we, by the way. He says, I find the metaphor of dance helpful for our reflections. In this dance, the two partners take each other seriously and stay on the dance floor with each other. But that commitment is the only factor that is constant, mutual, and serious. Beyond that, everything is open for both partners and yet to be decided. The partners dance in many postures, many locations, many varied relationships in which nothing can be counted on from the other one, except that each takes the partner seriously on the dance floor. The metaphor of dance helps us understand that many different kinds of music may be used with many different paces. There are various times of intimacy and of freedom for both parties. At different times, either partner can take initiative and be responsible for the relationship. The way of the dance is never known beforehand, but contains surprises because improvisation may be undertaken by either party. The two parties do not dance always to the same tune or in the same spot. They arc all over the dance floor with many modes of both faithfulness and freedom. Obviously, such a metaphor will be difficult for anyone working from a presumption of immutability, for such a presumption is exactly what the dance metaphor rejects. What we experience in such a covenantal relationship is not immutability, but fidelity. Fidelity with enormous freedom. Okay, stop share. I love his description of the covenant. What I will do is I will make a PDF of these slides and I will send them out to you so you will have them so you don't have to like furiously try to remember everything that was said. But I think this is beautiful because we're both free, both sides, to respond to the covenant or not to keep it or not to keep it. Okay, get away from all the sun. Okay, so we have a few minutes left, and if people have questions, comments, please. Anybody?
I have one question that I didn't get a chance to ask. My question is about, I think it's Genesis 16. It's the story of Hagar with regard to the idea of a covenant. How do Jewish rabbis and the kind of cyclical tradition of reading, how does that address the story of Hagar with regard to this covenant with the land that is promised to Abraham?
Okay, so as in many of the stories in Genesis, there are often two sons. Usually the younger one is the one who inherits the covenant, not the older one, which is the reverse of how things actually took place in real life. So the covenant is with Isaac, not with Esau. I'm sorry, not with Ishmael. It's with Isaac, not with Ishmael. It's with Jacob, not with Esau. And so, of course, the Muslims take Ishmael and say, he's the guy who gets the covenant, at least with us. Now, there are some people in our tradition up through today, but starting way back when, who do criticize what goes on with Hagar. So it's Genesis 16 as well as Genesis 21 in both, or 22. There are two stories of Hagar being kicked out of the house. Either she flees because she's been mistreated, or she is actually kicked out. She's the handmaiden of Sarah, and Sarah's barren for a very long time. So she asked her husband, Abraham, to sleep with Hagar. And that's actually a surrogate motherhood, which existed in those days, believe it or not. We didn't invent it in the 20th century. There was surrogate motherhood, and there were laws written about how the surrogate mother and how the child was treated. So the idea here was going to be that Sarah was going to have a child through Hagar because she was barren. So Hagar does sleep with Abraham. She has a son, but the son never becomes Sarah's son. And eventually Sarah has her own son. And Hagar and her son Ishmael are kicked out into the desert. So the story of her being kicked out into the desert comes right before Abraham is told by God to sacrifice his own son, Isaac. And there are very strong parallels between those two stories. I actually wrote a paper about this because I believe, as do some other people who've looked at the stories, that the sacrifice of Isaac, he was never actually sacrificed, but the story of the sacrifice of Isaac, or the binding of Isaac, is in a sense payback to Abraham and Sarah for the way they treated Hagar. I pronounce it Hagar. Hagar, I guess, is the sort of more American pronunciation. But Abraham takes Hagar out into the desert with her son, and they almost die in the heat of the desert. All they had was a little bit of water with them, and they're now thirsty and hot. And at the very last minute, right before they're going to die, or right before Ishmael is going to die, Hagar sees a well and is able to save her son. The story of Abraham taking Isaac up on the mountain is very similar, because he almost kills his son. He's stopped by the angel of God and sees a ram to sacrifice instead. And if you look at the two stories, there are some very strong parallels. And my Bible teacher, Tamara Eskenazi, basically said, and this is true for everybody in our society as well, our privilege and our bounty is very much at the expense of other people. So Abraham and Hagar and Isaac are the ones who inherit the covenant with God, and somebody suffers at their expense. And if you think about our society, we have these wonderful phones, right? Many assembled in China, where people are basically treated like slaves, indentured servants, right? I don't remember the name of the place in China. I remember John Oliver did a piece on this, where people are basically living in these like dormitories, working very long hours, getting paid really tiny amounts of money. And is it called Foxcom, I think? Is that what it was called? Yeah, Foxcom. And people were so depressed working there that they started committing suicide by jumping out the window. So you know what Foxcom's remedy was? They put nets under there. Okay, not to mention the Uyghurs, who are Muslims who are being held in concentration camps. We buy a lot of stuff from China, and look what China does to the people who work there. So these stories, the reason they've had the staying power they've had is because they say a lot about who we are as human beings. These guys who wrote this stuff really understood that. So that's the Hagar story, to me, is there to remind us, hey, guess what? Our privilege is not without a price. Yes, Beverly.
So I really had an epiphany listening to you, I have to say. It was because I think that what happened for me was I had to change my understanding of who God was to survive, because I couldn't live without God, but I couldn't live with my old God. So now it's sort of trying to figure out again, if I have to change my relationship to God or my understanding of God to sort of reclaim part of being a Jew. Do you know what I mean?
Yes. Well, I would say, you know, the God in the Torah, I mean, again, I believe that that it was written by human beings. This is how they understood God at that time. But again, it's always an evolving understanding. And we are going to do a session on different ideas of God in Judaism. There's the book Finding God, or there are two books. Finding God was the original one, and then they updated it to be called Various Jewish Responses or something like that, because they added some women in there. Yeah, women theologians. So there are a lot of ways of understanding God, and they're all perfectly legitimate. Again, what's important is, you know, what does God expect of us? That's the important thing, I think, anyway, personal opinion. Other comments? No? Well, you guys asked excellent questions and made some excellent comments. As I said, I'm going to copy this, make a PDF and send it to you so you will have the material. I hope you noticed that originally we were not going to have a class on January 24th because we were going to have a congregational meeting that day, but that got changed. So we will have the class on the 24th. And then on the 30th is when we won't have a class. Are there any questions about the syllabus, about the schedule, anything like that? No? Yes, Bobby?
If we want to see this thing this link.
I will send that to you.
Oh, you're going to send it. Okay.
Yes,
Sorry.
I will send you the link and I will send you the PDF. I will have to upload it to the to our channel, and I will do that. So you can watch this over and over again. Okay, well, it was great to have all of you. So great to finally, you know, meet. Well, I've met most of you, but to see you in class together, and look forward to further discussions and conversations. And if I don't have an appointment to meet with you, please, you know, if you're interested in conversion or you want to have further discussions, please contact me and we'll set up a Zoom meeting, because all our life now is Zoom. Okay, take care.
Thank you, Suzanne.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye.
Sure.
Bye, everybody. Take care.
Thanks so much.
Bye.
Great to meet everybody.
Okay.
Bye-bye.